very excited to have them with us. So Kylie is Director of Open Streets with Living Streets Alliance. She is a co-founder of Living Streets Alliance, a nonprofit advocacy-based organization that for the past 10 years has advocated for a thriving Tucson by creating great streets for all of us. LSA, or the Living Streets Alliance, envisions streets as living public spaces that connect people to places and each other. Kylie entered transportation advocacy via the bicycle, which she has used to primarily get herself around for nearly 2 decades. That's very impressive, to me anyway, including the 5 years that she spent working as a high school teacher in the far southeast part of Tucson. Kylie has also been an avid walker since the age of 1. Kylie will be highlighting the need to rethink our transportation and paradigm and sharing the ways that you can become an advocate. We also have Catlow Shipek here, who is a Watershed Management Group's Policy and Technical Director. He will be talking about something that we may only think about when we have rain, and that is how our streets and our rivers are connected, and how he will also talk about what we can do to become an advocate and what it means to our communities and our rivers. And as I mentioned before, we'll be pausing and answering questions submitted via the chat box periodically. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we would love to have you all stick around and answer some more questions and have a little bit more of a conversation. So we might be able to unmute you all at the end as well. So without further ado, I will let Catlow start.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm going to put you on the spot in that Kylie and I are avid bike riders and alternative transportation users. So I know you just recently moved. Have you started riding your bike?
I have not, but I would like to. So yes, Kylie said I recently moved closer to the office, which is where I am right now for Watershed Management Group. And it's about a 20-minute bike ride and a 5-minute drive. And I like to sleep in sometimes. So I will be working more towards riding my bike and getting up a little earlier to be able to do so. Cool. It has lots of benefits, and I think we'll talk about that today.
So I'm hoping that with what I share, and then I'm really excited with what Kylie's going to be sharing, that it moves all of us to greater action and thinking about, like, it's not just about the trees and the green infrastructures. We really have to think about our streets as all of these integrated linkages to all of these other facets of our lives and our communities, and how they so greatly influence us, mostly negatively right now, but could be a very positive force. But it's really going to take not just focusing on the green infrastructure side, but also focusing on how do we ourselves get around in our communities. So I think thumbs up if you can see my screen, the presentation. We're good? Okay. So being a watershed group, watershed management group, we focus on watershed health. And so a great way to do that is to follow the water. So typically that starts at our homes, our places of business, maybe schools, churches, all produce a lot of stormwater that we then like to advocate for rain gardens and rain tanks and those types of things. But eventually that overflows into the street. And so then we can also follow that path along our street. And that's where it brings us today, is thinking about what is the role of green infrastructure? How do we deal with that stormwater along our streets to improve our communities? And then we can continue to follow that path of that water all the way through our upland arroyos. How can we enhance infiltration to across our floodplains, and then ultimately to restore our rivers? And it's with that it's that recognition that we can't restore our rivers until we restore our streets. We can't restore our streets unless we're working at our homes or places of business. So it's really going to take this widespread, collective, distributed approach. So today's session, we're going to focus on what are the linkages in the streets for enabling us, our community, to achieve this vision of restoring our rivers, and why that's so important. So with that, many of you are probably familiar with green infrastructure based on the poll results. You're very interested in learning about green infrastructure, but I was also excited to see that you're also almost equally interested in learning about all of the other facets related to streets and ways to take action. So just simply, there's a huge amount of stormwater moving down our streets, so we can easily infiltrate that just through simple curb cut openings that moves that into the landscape portion, or maybe we create new landscape areas within our streetscapes to grow trees, grow plants, and we get so many benefits from this. So thinking about all the stormwater that moves in, we're treating that stormwater so it's cleaner, it produces more soil moisture, we can grow those plants without irrigation, to then growing shade, to beautifying, to calming traffic, to whatever it may be. However, we need to kind of take a step back before we get super excited about, hey, let's just plant trees and do green infrastructure. We have to take a step back and kind of consider, what are we working with? What's the opportunity? And to me, there's so much opportunity, and there's room to create more opportunity. But at the moment, that's because 25 to 40% of our urban surface areas are roads and streets. That's a tremendous amount of stormwater that's now being produced that is heading and flushing straight to our rivers and creeks. So it's not just our streets. Because we prioritize using personal vehicles, we now have to dedicate not only our streetscapes to personal vehicle transportation, we now have to dedicate our own workplaces and homes to accommodate those personal vehicles. So driveways, parking lots, drive-throughs. Drive-throughs are my bane, especially being a bike rider. It's like, what's the point of a drive-through? I don't want to sit in a hot car. But anyways, so there's just so much. And so this map, I've just put a green star where WMG's Living Lab is, and I'm going to zoom in where that yellow square is to just kind of give you a little bit more recognition of how much asphalt is out there. It's literally a sea of asphalt. So those are our roads, and those are our parking areas and driveways. And I'm probably even missing some other areas. So think about how much less space there is available to do something productive. And that's the point of this, is we have so much more opportunity we can create if we start to choose alternative transportation and we start to think about our urban infrastructure a little bit differently. And so with that, it's also about tree canopy. I mean, Phoenix just had the most heat-related deaths this year than ever, and it's a growing trend. Tucson's not far behind. So thinking about heat stress is a huge public health issue. And with that, we have a community goal of having 25% tree canopy. Well, how are we going to achieve 25% tree canopy with so much asphalt out there? But it's interesting is we can achieve it, but we're not really working well towards that. So with this map, what I wanted to highlight is, where are the bus stops, where are the schools? Because typically those are the folks using alternative transportation or relying on it. And then where's the tree canopy? So this star on the far right is WMG's Living Lab. We have Elcon Mall, which some of you may be familiar with, and we have the U of A Stadium. So I just wanted to give some reference points. But where is the green? The green is, look at this neighborhood. That's El Encantado. That's, I think, is the name of the neighborhood. It's a fairly wealthy neighborhood, and they're achieving 25 to 35% tree canopy cover versus, closer West University. So this is kind of the Dunbar Spring area where Brad Lancaster lives, 10 to 20%. And Brad's been planting trees for like 20 years. So this has probably grown quite a bit from what it used to be. But then we look at the Elcon Mall, 3% tree canopy coverage. So and you can feel the difference. You move from Reed Park to the Elcon Mall area on a hot summer night, and you can dramatically feel that difference. Now we move into southern Tucson, and look, how much green do you see? Not much. So we have the airport. This is the airport terminal. This is Pima County, I forget which branch, Pima County Community College, Pima Community College, along the Santa Cruz River. We actually did a floodplain restoration project here in the Midvale neighborhood right along the Santa Cruz River, working under regional flood control district. But look at this tree canopy coverage. It is 5 to 8%, 8 to 12%, 3 to 4%. So this is what's affecting our neighborhoods, and it's very much an equity issue. Is these are underserved areas. They're not historically not receiving a lot of support, and so we're seeing that play out from a tree canopy percentage, which directly relates to then public health heat stress issues. So getting back to that heat map with bus stops and schools, this is the heat map where yellow, the warmer the color, the hotter the temperatures. Look, it's right along our arterials where our bus stops are running. So somebody trying to access a bus stop or trying to even go to a school, there's different schools that are highlighted. It's hot, it's really hot out there, but then look at this sea of blue, this cooler temps. So that's those Sam Hughes neighborhoods, some of the other neighborhoods compared to other neighborhoods with very little tree canopy. And it's even more drastic once we move to South Tucson or Southern Tucson region. So even with some red temperatures. So this is a huge issue. And then when we start thinking about who's vulnerable, so heat vulnerable populations, this is actually mapped out. This is PEMA Association of Governments prioritization tool. You can clearly see who's going to be most affected. And then as we move back into Southern Tucson, it's even worse. So highly vulnerable communities. And Tucson has many great things. So we have a commercial rainwater harvesting ordinance. Do you think it's based on those photos, it's doing us any good right now? I don't see much shade. Oops, sorry, wrong arrow, wrong direction. So this is where we're working. A number of other organizations are now working to transform our streetscapes, remove that asphalt, plant the water, plant the trees. And a lot of times that's with community. So we rely on community because there's not a lot of investment funding moving towards this. So a lot of it's relying on us as stewards of our community to put these forward. But now think about who are the organized neighborhoods who have the means to connect with their ward offices and such, or other NGOs. So thinking about, okay, which neighborhoods are getting this? Again, it still drives back to an equity issue. I just wanted, it's not just happening here in Tucson. This was a green infrastructure in La Paz, Mexico. So it's happening all over these arid land regions. And this is, again, relying on volunteer community support to drive these practices forward. And it can be very beautiful. I mean, it can be very transformative and makes it much more enjoyable for biking, pedestrians. And so over the years, WMG's put out a number of resources. You can download these for free on our website. It really helps you become more informed of how do you engage your neighborhood association, how do you engage your city or county government agencies, how do you engage your elected officials, how do you engage those engineers that are now tasked to working with you, so we can all work with common language. And then ultimately what we're seeing is, okay, all of this green infrastructure is getting implemented, but the reason we're here today is how do we steward this? How do we maintain this infrastructure and continue to ensure that we're getting that return on investment? So if you're wanting to dive into the specific maintenance practices, we call it rain garden care. You can download this from our website. It's actually getting a revamp. It should be, I think in the next 1 or 2 months, should be up. And most importantly is the city is now investing resources. So this is the new green stormwater infrastructure program, where now there's a dedicated fee associated with City of Tucson utility bills that will go to this fund to ensure that we are maintaining our existing green infrastructure. We're capitalizing to be able to build new green infrastructure. And partly, this is going to be focused on areas of where we're seeing inequities. So everybody's super excited about this program. I'm really excited. This has been probably a decade in the making. It was just passed and enacted this spring. So they're still hiring, they're still training city staff for this. But I think I just want to temper your excitement a little bit in that this is really needed. It's really important. We need to grow this investment. However, think about where we need to prioritize these funds. So going back to those heat maps, do we really need to prioritize the use of these funds in Sam Hughes and other neighborhoods, typically Midtown neighborhoods that have those connections, have more shade tree canopy, or should we be prioritizing these funds for use in heat vulnerable communities that really have very little to no infrastructure at the current moment? So I am super excited, but don't expect that this is going to revolutionize our community in the near term. This is a long-term endeavor. This is a long-term investment. And ultimately, it comes back to us. So this is green infrastructure that has gone in over the last decade. And I like to drive this point that we can put it in, the city can put it in, but if we don't have the buy-in of our community members, our neighborhood members to steward it, then really what is that return on investment? We can't just leave it to the city and the county to maintain these systems appropriately, because it's going to be a long time before they have the means and the means and the ways to be able to do that. So the far right is in Brad Lancaster's neighborhood, if you've heard of him, water harvesting guru, and he takes a very deliberate approach to stewarding and organizing his community to be able to steward those systems. And you can see the benefits, you can see the results. It's very impressive. So this is the charge I have for everybody here today, is be a more active steward. And it can be as simple as fixing those inlets, making sure they're not clogged, so the next time it rains, those basins get water, to picking up trash. Green infrastructure are great trash collectors. That's where everything falls. So it's better here than downstream in our arroyo or river. And this is the most recent flood wave that came down the Rito. What's on the leading edge of that flood wave is trash. And so it's just all getting picked up. Some of it gets caught in eddies, and you see those big eddy pools of Polar Pops, styrofoam cups. A lot of this is ending up in Marana, Santa Cruz River. Do you think they want our trash? So that's the effort for tomorrow, is get out there, focus on your neighborhood streets, focus on wherever that may be, picking up trash. I know we haven't had much stormwater this summer, but get it now before that next big storm comes. So I'd like to switch over to Kylie. Now, I wasn't sure, Kylie, if you wanted to highlight this meme or if I should.
I thought that this would just be a good transition. Why don't you talk? I'd be curious to hear what you talk about, how you talk about this meme.
I think this is a great visual in the amount of space required if we're going to all choose personal vehicles versus if we choose bikes or bus. And then thinking about, as we make that shift, and we can get others to make that shift, essentially we reduce the load on our streets, so we can now think about our streets in new and different ways, rather than just passing that volume of traffic through. We can reclaim these spaces. That's my point.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think this visual that you know, might be familiar to a lot of people really does that well. I mean, it really drives our point home, which is that what we need to do in the Tucson region is not build new roads, widen existing roads. We need to be thinking about ways that we can widen sidewalks and narrow the streetscape that we have for a whole bunch of reasons. And that's really what we try to focus on. Okay, so you're handing the slides over to me. Great, okay. Thanks, Catlow. So for those of you who aren't already familiar with our organization, I work with Living Streets Alliance, which is a nonprofit organization I helped co-found just about 10 years ago. Our mission statement is to advocate for a thriving Tucson by creating great streets for all of us. And our vision is that we see streets as living public spaces that connect people to places and to each other. So one of the key things that I think is really important to drive home about that visual that Catlow shared very early in the presentation, showing the aerial map of Tucson and noting how much of that space is designated to cars, you know, excluding the private driveways, excluding the private parking lots, 30% of our footprint in Tucson is public space, streets are public spaces that belong to each and every one of us. And the way our funding mechanism works, anytime you purchase groceries, anytime you purchase, you know, tickets to a concert, anytime you purchase a bicycle, you're paying taxes that go to fund our streets, whether or not you drive a car or whether or not you drive a car very often. So however you're choosing to get around, we're all paying for our streets. And we've long been bothered by the fact that our streets in the Sun Belt, particularly in Tucson, have really been geared towards a car-dependent lifestyle, and it really limits our choices. It limits our mobility and freedom. It definitely limits the way kids grow up and interact with their environment in our communities. And so we've been really dedicated towards changing that paradigm. And there's some kids in the background having a great time. So what I want to talk to y'all really quickly about are just some things that are happening in Tucson. Some programs we have a role in, and some of them we don't have a role in at all. But I want to make you aware of what's happening in Tucson to help shift that paradigm, even during times of COVID, even during times of shelter in place. And that first program is Slow Streets. So many of you may have seen Slow Streets popping up in your neighborhoods. This is a city-driven initiative that is funded by CARES Act funding that was set aside by mayor and council approval in May, I want to say. And the goal is to temporarily turn designated residential streets into slow streets that support people getting out and getting physical activity, being active, and even, you know, socializing from a safe distance, but on streets that are slow traffic and residential. And they're doing this in a couple different phases. So the first phase is that they're putting out different barricades and configurations that you might see create a traffic circle for people to drive slowly around. And they might actually be barricades that encourage people to not drive through the streets, that are for local traffic only. And all of this is to encourage cars that are on these streets to either get off of them or to drive really slowly to get where they need to go. This is something that really quickly into the pandemic we saw happening in cities all over the country. Living Streets Alliance was really excited about it. We urged our local leaders to take a look at this kind of program and try it out. Then, of course, you know, we have our super hot summers, and you know it's a cool day when you see your neighbors out walking around on their streets, walking their dogs. We haven't seen many of those lately, but we're getting ready, hopefully, to see a lot more of them, and that will be a great time to see this Slow Streets program really ramp up. I've included the website there so that you can go there and get more information. You know, the application period for neighborhoods to apply to be a slow street closed on August 7th. I heard that they had over 100+ applications from different neighborhoods all across the region to be a part of that program. I don't think that they have any way that they can provide resources for all of those. So on the next slide, I want to talk about some other things we've been seeing people do around town, which was, you know, pretty early on. We also saw people just taking matters into their own hands and doing DIY slow streets using whatever materials they have available to them. Now, obviously, I don't work for the city. I am an advocate that works closely with the city. I have a responsibility to tell you that there's no legal basis for doing something like this. It's probably going to get removed by the city or get reported perhaps, but I do think that there is this moment where if you have good connections with your neighbors and you know that there's a lot of kids, people of all different ages living on your street, and that by talking to folks that they would support something like this, I think this is a real chance for people to try these kinds of things out. You know, I've heard of people doing this, just dragging the barriers out into the street after school was done, just to give kids some space to roam. You can rotate, you know, which families are hosting so that somebody's always got their eyes on the street. But I think the key here is just like the work you all are doing with watershed management and the Steward in Place events and the work that Brad Lancaster spearheads in his neighborhood to get people together to take care of the streetscape. This is another way that you can think about doing it. Again, this is totally DIY. This is not condoned. I'm sure if there's anybody from the city watching this right now, I apologize, but again, I think these are public spaces. And if we don't have enough resources to go around right now to make these spaces that people can get out and exercise and feel connected again to their neighborhoods, I don't see any problem with doing something like this. And I'm going to start doing this in my neighborhood too. Okay, next slide. I did want to let you know about something else that y'all may have read about in Steve K's newsletter over a year ago already, that we have not had the time to investigate whether or not this can be used for that kind of DIY application. But if you recall, over a year ago, there was a revision to the neighborhood block party ordinance that was spearheaded by different groups to make it easier for neighbors to have block parties in their streets. And I put a box around the yellow area there. They removed fees to close a street. They want to make sure you're only closing residential streets, not arterials or collectors, the bigger streets. You know, you need to contact your ward office to see if this is even something that the city would entertain right now, because I know they are not granting any special event permits at this time. However, I think that there's a case to be made. You know, each ward office was given, if you look at that red underlined part there, they were given a set of barricades and cones through a grant that we helped co-write from the Tohono O'odham Nation to be able to use to block off traffic from streets for neighborhood block parties. Right now, those barricades and cones are just sitting in ward offices, not being used. Their intended purpose is for small scale neighborhood block parties, but I would want to contact ward offices and see if that's something that neighbors can use just to block off a street to let kids play on them as weather gets cooler. So, you know, reach out to your ward office and ask them about that. And you can't actually, well, if you can go back for a second, I think I was trying to find more information about these neighborhood block party programs right now. I couldn't find it on the city's website, but again, this is from Steve K's newsletter. So do with that what you will. All right. I also wanted to let you know about Streateries Parklets, also called flex zones. These are spaces that are popping up in our highly dense or denser commercial districts like 4th Avenue, like downtown and Main Gate Square, different areas where the scale of the streets are not so wide that you could actually conceive of taking some on-street parking and expanding open air seating, cafe seating for people to be able to support local businesses by sitting outside. These are happening in Tucson. So there's a number of them already going in downtown. 4th Avenue is about to embark on a program similar to this. And I think this is, again, great timing for Tucson here because we're just going to be entering into cooler weather. I think some things for people to think about here in terms of advocating for these things are if you see businesses that you support that would be good candidates for something like this, talk to them. Talk to your ward office, talk to us, see if we can help that reach out to them and talk to them about doing something like this. And then if there are places that have these, you know, go and support them. You don't have to sit outside if it doesn't feel comfortable to you yet. But what we're hoping is that as we enter into the fall and spring and winter and we see more of these pop up, people will realize what we've been trying to say for 10 years is that car parking space on the street is not a good economic use of public space. There's a lot of different ways that that space can be used to generate economic activity, to enhance the walkability experience for people, and in times of COVID to provide an easy way for businesses to expand their footprint without adding more retail or business space. So that's an example of what a really well done streetery parklet looks like. You don't block the pedestrian thoroughfare there on the sidewalk, and then you actually take a parking space and build a protected barrier around people and encourage them to sit out there. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll show you what we've got happening here in Tucson. So these are two examples. The one on the left is new. The one on the right is old. And the one on the right, I don't think you can see super well. I apologize for that. But if you want to go down and check it out, it's on Congress. It's in front of Batch, which is a donut and whiskey bar, I think. And the one on the right is an example of what's called a non-contiguous parklet, which means it's not connected to the actual establishment. It leaves the sidewalk open for people to be able to walk through, but people can still go to that business and bring an alcoholic beverage or whatever else they want out to that area. They just can't leave that parklet area that's barricaded off. The one on the left is new. It hasn't even been opened yet. This is in front of Penka on Broadway. And when we saw the plans for this and saw this getting built, it was alarming to us. And the reason why is because the actual place where patrons will be sitting is contiguous. It's up next to the restaurant there. You can see the planters on the right side, and then there's a fence post sticking out. There's actually a chain welded to that fence that will go across during open business hours and keep people from cutting through the area there. And what the Department of Transportation has done, thank you, as a walk around, is brought curb level ramps on the left side there, and they've actually taken over parking spaces to accommodate people walking around the eating area. And all of that is a great workaround. I just can't help but feel in these times of expanding economic inequality that this just really sends the wrong message about who this is designed for, who matters. And for us, we don't want to see more parklets or streeteries designed in this way. The very first one in Tucson that was designed in this way, you can see it, Downtown Kitchen and Cocktails. You know, that one's got like a wider sidewalk and people walk around it right next to the post office there downtown. And when that one got built, you know, we thought it was maybe just kind of an aberration and they weren't going to keep doing that because of this detour that it makes people who are walking take. But we're seeing more of these pop up. So I would just say, if this is something that's concerning to you too, to maybe get in touch with your council members and let them know that yes, it's important to support businesses and keep them thriving during this tough time, but we don't want to do it at the expense of the dignity and the walkability experience of people walking, not to mention people in wheelchairs and pushing strollers. All right, so next. Prop 407 is another incredible street transformation project that is happening. It was approved by voters in 2018, and giant caveat here, it does not include any funding for street resurfacing, which is problematic, nor does it include much funding for permanent landscaping like chicanes that are landscaped with trees and native plants. It does allow for some of that, but not much. It's important to know if there's a Prop 407 funded project coming to your area, because a lot of the bond market right now, because of the low interest rates and the economic instability, is making it possible for the city to sell more bonds faster to get a lot more of these projects in the ground sooner than they had anticipated. And that means that the engagement schedule is accelerated. So on the next slide, I show you map, maybe you've seen this before, on the lower right-hand corner of where these funded projects are going in. In addition to parks improvements in almost every single park in Tucson, there's connections to those parks. And those include things like bicycle boulevards, sidewalks, multi-use paths, and other corridors that are going to help people reach those parks, as well as create new parks. So what I wanted to show you here, okay, we are looking right now at some slides from an open house that just took place earlier this week for a section of street that a lot of people might be familiar with. It's in the West University neighborhood on University Boulevard, just west of 4th Avenue in front of the historic Y. So this is part of the 3rd Street University Bicycle Boulevard that's going to go from Stone, so just at the edge of Dunbar Spring neighborhood, all the way to Wilmot. It's our largest, it's our longest and most used bicycle boulevard in the region, with, in normal times, 3,000 bicycles on it a day. The configuration that's under discussion here in the open house, I have some images of for you there to take a look at. This is what's being, there's 2 different proposals for Stone Avenue to Herbert, which is basically Stone to 4th Avenue. And the 2 different discussions here are, should we make a protected bike lane, which is option 1 at the top, or should we make a buffered bike lane, which is option 2 on the bottom? And the reason why I'm using this as an example for you all is because when we think about how car dependent we are when we think about how people respond to changes in their travel patterns or changes in their neighborhoods, it gets very personal very fast, and it makes it difficult to, it makes it easy to lose track of the bigger picture. So these two different proposals for how this street should be reconfigured is unfortunately controversial, because the top image there of a protected bike lane would remove approximately 1/3 of the private parking spaces that are along University Boulevard. Many of the houses on University Boulevard were built before car dependency was a thing, and so there aren't garages or driveways for people to park their car. They rely on parking them on street. But you can see the proposal here is actually suggesting that they take the remaining on-street car parking that would exist and remove it from the curb, away from the sidewalk, out into the street, and then put the people on bicycles closer to the sidewalk, and then add a painted buffer with flex posts in the middle. Now, the dimensions we're talking about here are about 5 feet for that area where the person's bicycling, about 3 feet painted buffer, and then flex posts, which are intended to go in increments to keep cars from driving in and parking into that area. Some of the early feedback we've heard is that people dislike the idea of cars being used to protect people on bicycles. They dislike the idea of losing parking spaces. But we got to, again, think about, you know, the bigger picture. So compare that to the other option, which is down below on the lower left, which would leave the parking where it is, not remove any car parking from the area, and provide a wide bike lane, about 5 feet again, with a 3-foot painted buffer. It's, you know, it'd basically be the same configuration as above, minus the flex post and minus using cars as a buffer for people. And it was really interesting to hear people debating the two different options. You know, the city of Tucson is trying really hard to design a bike network that is all ages and abilities friendly, and that not only uses these opportunities to provide comfortable facilities for people to bike on, but also to use these opportunities to slow traffic and to narrow the travel lanes so that cars aren't zipping through these residential areas at high speeds. So I want you to just think about this, because something like this, you know, this is not a proposal that would make sense in a lot of residential areas. This is one that's unique because it comes so close to a commercial area. But there's a lot of work to be done in talking with our neighbors about some of the bigger picture reasons for narrowing the roadway, for, you know, making our streets equitable for people using different modes. All right, next slide. So, and with that in mind, I can't, you know, leave this presentation without talking to you all about our own personal journey as a white-led organization during this time of Black Lives Matter organization and a resurgence in the fight for racial justice, to, you know, encourage you all to reach out to us if you would like some ideas on where to do some readings and to do some reflection on how public space and how we design and allocate public space vis-a-vis our streets means for racial, social, and economic justice in our communities. You know, personally, I thought we were a pretty, you know, aware organization when it came to thinking about the historical context of segregation and, you know, the unequal distribution of resources and the trauma that a lot of communities experience and what that means for their ability to come together and advocate for themselves. But it really didn't drive the point home to me until I saw pictures of George Floyd with the police officer on his neck. And in the background of that picture, which is iconic, there was a bike lane. And an advocate pointed out to me that, you know, no bike lane on any street could have saved George Floyd's life. So we have a lot to do before we can take up this fight of you know, I always thought that what we were really fighting was like car dependency and a shift towards, you know, reallocating things from the car. But what I think we also need to keep in mind is that none of this is going to matter if we don't work towards a society that is, you know, equitable. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's my my last slide, but I do welcome anybody to reach out to us if you're looking for things to read about these issues. We are keeping a long list that we're happy to share with you all.